because I was afraid I was going to ramble. And I'm not going to use a script because I don't want to swear. Anyways, this is me. I'm Ozzy. This is Wyatt. He's doing lecture number 2. Yeah, that's Wyatt. And yeah, this is Rodent Society lecture number 2. I was going to say a whole bunch of stuff. I don't want to say it anymore. All I want to say is that this lecture is like a love letter to architecture and like a manifesto at the same time. And it's urgent. That's just been a key word for me lately. It's just urgent, and you guys got to hear it. It's awesome. So let's do it. And we'll have like a Q&A and stuff like that after. All right, cool.
Cool. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. It really does mean a lot to me. Thank you to the Rodent Society, Ozzy, Alex, Sydney, Santi, Abigail, everybody who clutched up and helped make this possible. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot to me. So thank you very much. I know a lot of you. How many of you are architecture students? How many of you are not architecture students, or should I say? Okay, sick, very cool. How many of you are not anything design related? Like you don't? Okay. Sweet, wow, all right, cool. I know a lot of you guys are older than me. A lot of you might be grad students, graduates. You might be wondering, what do I know? And you might be right, but I think that in architecture and in this school, we don't risk enough. We don't put ourselves out there enough. We don't make things personal. We don't risk anything. So I'm gonna risk looking stupid, but I'm doing it for you guys. So, because I think I needed to hear this about a year ago. So if any of you are like me or not like me, this is for you. So, in this presentation, I'm going to be using just what I need to get by. I'm going to go through a bunch of quotes. I'm going to be going pretty quickly. Hopefully, let me know if I got to slow down. But if you are interested in anything that I go over, I urge you to look into it more. I can't give you the answers. I can sort of only give you the direction. You know yourself better than I do, like for sure. This is We Can Be So Much More. I am Wyatt Walski Rodriguez. Thank you again so much for coming. So let's begin. How did we fall so far from grace? Why is our discipline so often uninspiring? Why have we fallen short of those in the past who have made great works of art? So, really quickly, I'm going to go into, there's a contemporary philosophy called object-oriented ontology, and that's kind of a pervasive theme in the theoretical and practical arguments that I'm going to be making today. So, this is not just something that runs in a field. This is not something that stands in front of trees. This is not something under the sky. You could go on continuing to list all its relations to its surroundings, and you'll never know what it is unless you acknowledge the object in and of itself. It's a horse. You can list all these relations, all these qualities, but there's something that will always elude you because there are infinite relations and infinite qualities. There is the object in and of itself, and that's what object-oriented ontology, this contemporary philosophy, is very esoteric. It's a little silly, but it's important. A lot of artists and architects latch onto it because of this emphasis on the object in and of itself. Something does not have value just because of its relation or its reference to something else. It has a value in and of itself. And I'm going to say that a lot. In and of itself is going to be ringing through this room. But we can look at something like Marvel movies or things like that. And a lot of them fall short because the movie does not stand alone as its own thing. It's built on references of the metaverse or I don't know what they call it. But it's all based on references, and it's just a web of other things, and nothing stands alone. Architecture is falling into a similar problem. It's different because obviously there are physical connections that we have to make to the ground, or functions, or things like that. So there are certain relations that we can't break from, but there is an architectural object in and of itself. This is Mark Foster Gage. He's a theorist and an architect. The picture on the left is kind of ugly, but the building is interesting. So, he is very interested in object-oriented ontology, and he says that we undermine and overmine the architectural object. And I'll get into that. He says that we can undermine the architectural object when we judge it by its lower-end qualities or relations. For instance, something like that's greenwashed, that's supposed to look sustainable. We judge it only by its sustainable qualities or its perceived sustainability. We can judge it by, we can judge an architectural object inappropriately if we judge it by a specific room or a specific function. We can also overmine it. Oh, I went backwards. We can also overmine it when we look at its higher order relations. So its contextual assimilation, its ability to look maybe like a bird or accomplish some other gesture. We are still missing the object in and of itself. This phenomenon occurs with the architect themselves, and this has largely led us down our complacency, or our path of complacency. According to David Rui, he's a professor at SciArc, he says that the desire for relevance and recognition in current affairs and other expertise has led the architect to abandon their specificity, their area of expertise, and instead spread their knowledge across a wider range of fields. This has left the identity of the architect vague and potentially useless. Wait. Have you ever been listening to an upperclassman or a professor and they're talking about something related to their building? They're talking about some skewed graph or collection of data. And you kind of can get the sense that they don't quite know what they're talking about, and you're probably right. The architect recently, like now, has kind of started talking about things that they don't know about, and they've overstepped their bounds. Now we can look at this picture. What Gage and Rui are arguing in these excerpts is that the architect felt left out, and as a result abandoned their identity. Actually, even worse, they think that everything that they touch is blessed by their presence. And this is not true. We have a niche. The architect knows nothing about political science, about statistics, about geography, etc. The architect barely knows about building. If they were asked to take on the role of an engineer or a construction manager, the building would fail. This is also true for any of these other roles. They cannot do what the architect does. If you see yourself performing as an architect only what an engineer or a contractor or a construction worker could do, you're probably just a technicality. You are not fulfilling the role of the architect, and this applies also to other arts. You need to fulfill your role as the creator and the designer. I just think these Instagram comments are funny because they'll be like showing a work of art of an architect, and then the comments will be like, what about the engineers? But it's like, okay, like what about the construction workers? There's always a bigger fish. Everybody, does their own thing. We need to appreciate the roles that we fill and the roles that we don't fill as well. The point is that each part of the building process and the building itself has its own goals and qualities. The architect is mistaken in thinking that all that he might touch benefits from his presence. We have a niche just like everybody else, and we have to suck it up. If you want to be an engineer or a political scientist or a writer or a geologist or a landscape architect, quit wasting the time of both this career and the discipline you seek and commit to that one. What you want is noble and valuable, but stop cheating and marry your true love. Don't try to change architecture. It's not her, it's you. Architecture isn't just about making buildings work. We are not creative, and we want architecture to be simple and digestible to us. If you approach design as a series of yes or no questions, you will be left with a flat result. You will not have any of the transcendental qualities that make architecture. There will be no ambiguity. Architecture isn't a yes or no answer. You have to elaborate past what you can describe. Then you will not be bounded by the art of word, and you can start making architecture. Research architecture is a phrase coined by Mark Foster Gage in his defense of design. He says, no longer is it sufficient to be a mere line. He says that a line that is the foundation of art, of architecture, these gestural lines, these lines in and of themselves are justified. This is the foundation of our craft. But he argues that no longer is it sufficient to be just a line. Now lines have to be pulled from a group of graphs, or they need to be connecting to things. They can't just stand as their own thing. They need to be justified by external factors. He says that research architecture is not valuable because it assumes that there is something valuable to be made when architecture and research combine, as if we will not lose anything by muddying up these professions. Basically, the architect is trying to do research in something other than architecture, all the while slyly smiling to themselves that the result will always be some mid-century modern shitty house, no matter what the data says, which is a problem because they argue that the line cannot be ambiguous or have a reason in and of itself, and yet the factors that they pull from to justify their lines are just as ambiguous and useless and have completely no relation to the result that they're trying to achieve. The answer to everything is not architecture. The one who knows everything is not an architect. You are not doing research and you are not doing architecture. You don't know about either. Both are harder than you think, and you are just scared of the blank page. We have the responsibility to make something good, and you cannot justify your own actions because they are not good. and you are not creative, and you are scared. You look at a Cartesian graph of frog births in Ecuador, and you think that that can possibly justify your facade. You don't know anything about facades or frogs, and you're doing a disservice to both with your pseudoscience. He continues. He says, the practice of research architecture neglects intuition. It looks at only intelligence and this just the accumulation of data. I keep misspeaking that, but whatever. He argues that intuition has been the foundation of architecture, and it has held a very special role in architecture and art, and we cannot let it fall away. He quotes Vitruvius, the man who wrote the first book of architecture, where he says that architects at times should neglect the rules and break the rules simply for aesthetic reasons that can only be revealed to them through their own strokes of genius, through this intuition. It cannot be proven by science, it cannot be proven by this data. Said it right. Henry Bergson, he got a Nobel Prize for his work about creativity. He says that intuition can give us what intelligence cannot and can supplant it. A theory of knowledge must include intelligence and instinct. We must develop intuition. It is valuable as the expression of all that you are, all that you have, all that you will be, and all that you want to be. It is talent, and it is why you will succeed or why you will fail. Understand the lineage in which you will work, the people you will stand beside in history. You need to build an intuition of architecture as its own art form. This is whatever. Le Corbusier says that it is necessary to understand history, and he who understands history knows what has been, what will be, and he can link these two to make what is now and what is necessary. I put him in a Chicago Bulls jersey. I put him in a Jordan jersey because some people think he's the GOAT, but that's because they're old. Nope. We need to move past our flimsy excuses. We need to make a building and make a decision based on our own shitty intuition. We have to fail and grow and try again and get so fed up that we just end up drawing some stupid roof, and then we fail again. And then you do it one more time and you might succeed, and then you will grow again, and you will leave the idiot critics behind and do something valuable for your city. Intuition is intelligence, and the line is self-reliant. I'm putting this page back down. The next chapter in my argument is more practical. The last time we looked at an architectural theorist, and now we're going to look at, one of the most famous architects in the world. So how does he do it? What is he doing? Frank Gehry, like I said, is one of the most famous architects currently practicing. Much of his work is directly or indirectly acting against the misinformed adoption of purism in modern architecture. In an interview with Art Forum, he says that I absolutely don't think being a purist is any more true to the craft of architecture. Critics will say that his buildings don't line up. His interiors do not match up directly with his exteriors. And he says that a building where the two line up is not any more simpler, any more honest, any more true to the nature of architecture. He goes on, I say that a lot too. He says, let's take the example of a small wood house, this pure structure before anything is added. It's simple, we can understand it, it's not being interfered, it's pure. But then what happens? You bring in the plumbers and the electricians and the HVAC contractors, and they start drilling holes, they start tearing the structure apart, they start putting their wires everywhere, filling it with things, and they totally violate the structure. They torture the purity out of this thing. So there's a conflict between this idea of an ideal structure and then what actually needs to go into a building to make it architecture. And he says that a lot of ideas of this purity and simplicity come from painting and do not apply to architecture. It is a different art form. He says you can't take an idea from one and expect it to work in the other. These are some paintings. This painting is by Le Corbusier, and the one on the left is one of his, could you say contemporaries if they worked at the same time? I think that's correct, but you know what I mean. They both were studying this cubist approach to painting. And what he did, why he was a successful architect, why he is kind of somebody that we talk about in class all the time, is because he saw this overlap between architecture and painting, and he brought architecture into painting. He took things from painting and brought it to architecture. He was always loyal to architecture. He wasn't a great painter, he was a great architect. And he just used ideas from painting to express architecture. The problem is, in his wake, we have only stuck between this architecture and painting, this overlap. We think that architecture is bounded completely by painting, and this is not true. Architecture exists in another boundless direction, completely irrelevant with painting. Purity still exists in architecture, but the references are different and shaped for our art form, and they take into account the dynamism inherent in a building and what makes it work. All these things are moving constantly. You can hear the air conditioning, you know the wires are all buzzing. There are things happening in a building. It's much more active than these purist blocks, which are good for their time, but we're not bounded by them, is the point. Too often in school, we treat our projects only as volumes or as a collection of vague tectonic parts. In reality, buildings are much more dynamic and complex than one might assume by looking at our approach. We need to realize this. Architecture is its own art form with no loyalties to the ideas of foreign crafts. It is a collage of different elements with different qualities and purposes. When a critic visited Frank Gehry's first residence for himself, he said that it reminded him of a Kurt Schwitter's collage, and this is exceedingly accurate. Oh, I keep going, I don't switch yet. Architecture is not exactly like collage. I don't want to claim that just how we were bounded by painting before, I don't want to now be bounded by collage. It is still independent, but there is a justifiable analogy here. The difference is that in collage, these elements are taken from things with different purposes. That stamp was probably used for something completely different than a Kurt Schwitter's painting. It undoubtedly was. But with architecture, each element that we're collaging is made specifically for this piece, specifically for this project. We cannot just take what is not ours. We can't try to replicate a classical building for the sake of trying to mooch off of its beauty. That building was born specifically between the process of its time, place, and people and architect. By by simulating the past, we are parodying and undermining the source material. But perhaps more importantly, we are discarding the value of our current context. The architect, you, who is making this project, or the artist, the people you're building for, the time and the place and the environment that you are currently in. We must free each element from the chains of its neighbor and let them flourish side by side. The synthesis of these unique and potentially otherwise unrelated elements is where one begins to find the unique value of architecture. You shouldn't let your floor plan just be a product of the structural system, and you shouldn't let your facade just be a product of the floor plan. These things have different purposes and different goals than the floor plan, than the facade, and the structure. When you refuse to let them be their own thing, you hold back their potential and the potential of your building. In this sense, brutalism is kind of architecture for babies. It was necessary and it's incredible, but to think that we're bounded by this is silly. We don't need, our facade does not need to reveal the interior structure, and even then, it's not a complete honesty. It's sort of a farce. Classical architects operated similarly to painters, putting their beautiful images within the frame of their established proportions and orders. Then, architects realized that they could design the frame too, and this was an important step in the realization of our identity. But then, we forgot to paint the picture. The painting and the frame have different goals that are synthesized with the discrete and important qualities like scale or orientation. They function as a whole and would be incomplete without the other. The object could not function, though, if the needs of these separate elements were not realized. Keep in mind, again, this is an analogy. I'm not trying to reassert that painting has anything to do necessarily with the rules of architecture, but rather instead of explaining painting through architecture, I'm trying to explain architecture through painting. So architecture stays, pure and undeterred. Painting is, we don't care about painting. Okay, we know the problems, we got it, we're set. But what do we do about it? How do we come back? How do we recover our soul? We shed our minds and the minds of our fellow students of the negligence we have adopted in complacency. Architecture is not just about solving problems. It is about something transcendental and mostly indescribable. Anyone talking about art tends to sound like an idiot because they're trying to capture the art of sculpture, let's say, with the art of word. You could describe a piece by Michelangelo for all time, and you will never capture that essence of the sculpture that he so eloquently put forth. The languages are different, and there's a lot that we can lose in translation. Your architecture needs to be the same. Architecture has the potential to achieve this quality when its language is embraced and used. Someone shouldn't be able to describe your building just with words, or if you're really good, they shouldn't be able to describe it with just a picture or a drawing. Architecture is an aesthetic discipline, firstly. The architect has a limited role in the completion of a building as a whole, and the sooner we stop denying that, the sooner we get out of the way of the people who know what they're doing and create something valuable through the true identity of our craft. We get our asses kicked and everyone's time wasted when we overstep. In our craft, we must consider and synthesize differences into a whole. That's most of what we do. Consider the separate goals of each architectural element and fulfill them while simultaneously creating an inspiring whole. Consider the art of architecture as its own, with separate goals and from other crafts to which it has no loyalty. Consider the building you create as its own, with separate goals and a separate identity from the buildings who came before it. Do not parody, copy, or simulate. Here, Theo van Doyesburg, or however you might say it, he argues in his essay Towards a Plastic Architecture that every time you approach a project, whether it be in art or architecture, you cannot have any preconceptions of form. You have to completely reapproach the problem or the prompt of architecture or art. It is necessary to pose the problem of architecture completely afresh. You cannot be held back by previous styles or previous approaches. This is a completely new project with a new time, and we must treat it that way. What? Oh, be humble. Frank Lloyd Wright, this guy, he says that the good building is one that makes the landscape more beautiful than it was before it was built. No, wrong. To think that your building can elevate the sublimity of the natural world requires the confidence of a man-whore like Frank Lloyd Wright, with all due respect to him, but with more respect to the countless spouses he cheated on. Sorry, he's such a dick. Architecture can only elevate the building. It cannot elevate the landscape, which is separately perfect. However, if the building is going to be built or has been built, we have an obligation to return even an ounce of the natural beauty which was taken away. We are competing not with other architects or with engineers or city planners. We're competing with the birds who make their nests, the ants who make their hills, the squirrels who, I don't know what they climb trees. We're competing with them, and we should be humbled in the wake of their perfect craftsmanship. This is architecture. So I'm going to drink my water. Okay, let's keep going. Don't overestimate the value of theory over practice and vice versa. They too are different languages with different qualities that we must synthesize in our work. We can look at early vernacular architecture around the world. It is perfect. It is intuitive. The goals and the function and the image, the goals of the function and the image are preserved but synthesized. Nothing oversteps or understeps. This is the value of practice. Look at the motivations and the perspectives of the greatest architects and artists and writers in the lineage of this craft. What inspired them? This is the value of theory. Finally, make architecture personal. I urge you to recognize the honor in a place and fight for it. Find the honor in the context of your project, whether that be in the natural, cultural, or other qualities in which you're building. If some of the greatest buildings in architectural history justified their ornament and their monumentality because they were essentially temples built to God or some portion of God, then we too must recognize the inherent value of that for which we build. Build a temple to the sick, to your dog, to your friend's grandmother, and make it beautiful because your friend's grandmother is beautiful. Find the honor in the natural world on which we build. and thus build less. Fix what has been built and should be celebrated. All we can beautify is the built environment, not the natural environment, so we should work to improve the former while leaving the latter to itself. We can also choose what portions of the built environment to beautify, to influence society aesthetically. Will you choose to make beautiful the Taco Bells and food deserts, surrounded by roads without sidewalks, to lift this scummy urban and economic dropping to something even slightly less revolting? Or will you decorate the mixed-use children's hospital that's also a library near a park? Celebrate those things you hold highly so others will do the same, and shun the ugly underbelly of the world until we can cut it off. Find the honor in architecture's place in society. Embrace your role and make something beautiful. Help others accomplish their goals that overlap with yours in your societies, even and especially if that means getting out of their way. Find the honor in the place you're in right now, this school, this town. If you don't feel inspired by this place, you're doing something wrong, and I'm speaking from experience. There are so many energizing minds at this school, and you just need to find those that speak to you, and most importantly, those that don't. Approach the people you admire, whether they be professors, upperclassmen, or underclassmen. Talk to them. For just a second, push aside your pride and learn from them. Then don't shy away from the people you disagree with, those people you might think are idiots, who know enough to care but not enough to agree with you. These are the people you should most interact with and who you should most be inspired by. These are the people you should compete with and argue with and laugh with and grow with. It's a lot of withs, even if it's a professor. Make this school a buzzing hive of discussion and competition and camaraderie. Make friends and make enemies, and honor the opportunity you have by being here. This is some work by a professor here. Many of you already know them. I guess actually a lot of you don't because you're not architecture students or design students. But I found these works last year and they kind of found me when I needed them the most. Before architecture school, I would have looked at them and I'd have been like, oh, he made them by drawing. But after a year or two in architecture school, I was like, how do you come to these conclusions? Because I was held back by these external justifications. The architect can no longer have intuition if we do that. And these were very inspiring to me and kind of prompted this research into these arguments that I'm making today. So I'm very appreciative of this professor's work. Architecture is inherently superfluous. We are the enemies of efficiency. Don't let go of the inspirations that brought you here, those things that you might feel are tacky or corny or distasteful. These are your inspirations, and just because you are learning more about architecture, about the lineage of this craft, does not mean that you should abandon them. Rather, you should find out how to express them through this new language. It means the absolute opposite. Architecture, as John Ruskin, a famous art critic and architecture critic, puts it, he says that it concerns itself only with those characters above and beyond its common use. Now we'll say it. Buildings can be made without an architecture. These buildings are structurally sound, they're efficient, they're well made, but they are empty and they are uninspiring, and they assume that people do not care. They do not add anything beyond material. They simply solve a problem with a bare answer, and this is not architecture. Ruskin continues, he says common because a building raised to the honor of God or in memory of men has surely a use to which its ornament, its architecture, fits it, but not a use which limits its efficiency. This is where we start to develop and express those transcendental qualities that only great works of art can have. He says, when we build, let it not be for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think that a time is to come when these stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them, and that men will say, as they look upon the labor and the wrought substance of them, see, this our fathers did for us. We must develop our knowledge of the architects who have come before us. We must work with our hands, our eyes. Every muscle and organ in our body has to test what we make to see that it is beautiful beyond words, beyond painting, beyond sculpture, beyond collage, beyond the hands and eyes and memory that were devoted to its conception, beyond even the present moment that birthed it. We must embrace the intuition that will develop. We must fail. Then we must succeed. because it is our job. Thank you.